Good afternoon, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to everyone here at the Falkirk campus of Forth Valley College, and also to everyone who's joining us online. It's absolutely great to see everybody here today. Thank you for taking the time, all of you here, all of you online, and we hope for a really engaging debate this afternoon. I'm very much looking forward to it. It's a hugely important topic, this conversation around the future of the Scottish curriculum. So I'm looking forward to all of your engagement in this conversation. You'll have that opportunity later on. But firstly, what I would really like to do is to introduce you to a very diverse panel that we have with us. We're very privileged to have them all here today. So I'll just run through all of them with you and introduce them to you. So first of all, we have somebody who I'm sure is no stranger to many of you in the room, and that is Professor Mark Priestley. Mark is the Professor of Education at the University of Stirling. His research interests lie in the school curriculum, theory, policy and practice, and especially the process of curriculum making across different layers of education systems. Mark is lead editor of the Curriculum Journal, and a member of the Scottish Government Key Education Advisory Committees, the Scottish Education Council and the Curriculum and Assessment Board. Welcome to Mark. Bruce Robertson has also joined us. Bruce is Rector of Berwickshire High School in the Scottish Borders and author of the Teaching Delusion trilogy of books published by John Catt Educational. And Bruce is followed by Rob Hubin. Rob is an education leader, change maker and public speaker. He started teaching in the year 2000. Meanwhile, he was involved in the building of new courses for the Dutch national curriculum. He specialised in personalising education across the best parts of regular education. He believes learning should start with building motivation, self-esteem and becoming a social networker. In 2015, he got involved with the newly created Agora, a government-funded secondary school without using timetables, without using courses or age groups. They support students to manage their own learning process, starting with a simple question. What do you want to make, do or learn? And whatever the answer is, they go from there. Then we have Dr. Jihan Alizawi. Jihan is a transition teacher for the Liberton learning community in the City of Edinburgh Council. A graduate of the MSc in Transformative Learning and Teaching at the University of Edinburgh, Jihan is dual qualified to teach across primary and secondary transitions, specialising in the BGE phase up to S3. As a transition teacher, Jihan is hoping to develop a more consistent BGE experience for pupils navigating the primary and secondary curricular transition. Next we have David Mitchell. David is a former pupil of Dunoon Grammar School, returning to take up the post of head teacher in 2013. He since led the school to a number of national and international accolades, including becoming the first Scottish school to win a European Entrepreneurial School Award and to present at World Education Week. Dunoon Grammar has been shortlisted to the final 10 of this year's World Best Schools prizes. And we have Jenny Watson, currently head teacher at Dice Primary School. She has worked across a wide variety of primary schools, including being head teacher at Middleton Park School and a senior education officer with the Curriculum Innovation Team at Education Scotland. Jenny is passionate about exploring innovative curriculum design. And lastly, we have Dr. Marion Burns. Marion completed her doctoral degree at Strathclyde University in 2019. Where her main research focus was children's transitions in school. Marion has travelled to New South Wales, New Zealand and Iceland to participate in a range of professional learning activities as part of the Pedagogies of Educational Transitions work package. She is a co-author of the National Guidance for Early Years in Scotland, Realising the Ambition, Being Me. She is a member of the IGELT editorial board and is the non-executive chairperson of the Early Years Scotland. Marion is a former HM inspector and who retired from Education in Scotland in 2021. I'm sure everyone can agree, I certainly do, that this is a very, very relevant topic for Scottish education, and we're looking forward to listening to the important contributions and perspectives that this panel have. Our discussion will be facilitated by Kenny McInnes, Vice Principal of Learning and Student Experience here at Forth Valley College, who will open and close the session And near the end of this discussion, he will invite questions from you and online. Without any further delay, over to you, Kenny.
Thank you, Jill. On behalf of Forth Valley College, I think it's a fantastic turnout today, so thank you for being here, and the college is absolutely delighted to facilitate and host this session today. A very esteemed panel, and I think we'll get straight into it. So the hot topic, Scotland's curriculum. Where should we go now? I think it's a very relevant question. So Scotland was the first to embrace 21st century learning movement. And from that came our Curriculum for Excellence in 2004, the concept, which was then launched in 2010, 2011. We've now had 12 years, we're now in the 12th year of Curriculum for Excellence. And I think where we should really start is asking the question in terms of the OECD report that was launched. So that is the report that was put forward by the Scottish Government, commissioned by the Scottish Government, and Scotland's CFE into the future. And I really want to ask the panel, is that report, the OECD report, reflective of educators' experience of Curriculum for Excellence? And I'll start with Mark.
I thought you were going to start with me. Hello, everyone. Yes, up to a point, I think it is. We've done a number of research projects now, going back around 10 or 12 years around Curriculum for Excellence, and we're seeing very similar themes to what the OECD talked about. So I would absolutely agree. I recognise the picture of an aspirational curriculum where the agenda is probably driven more by data, by an attainment agenda, and by the system, by the needs of the system. And I'll say a bit more about that later. But I mean, my overriding impression, I think, is that we have a system that dominates what happens in schools rather than serving. And I think we need to change that. I'll come back to those later.
Thank you, Mark. Rob, from an international perspective, this report, could you give your comments on it, please?
Yeah, well, of course I can do it from an international perspective because I'm Dutch. Have I read the full report? No, absolutely not. I'm a guy who's in the practice, you know, and adopts to what you're saying from there. Because what I see is that I'm a mathematic teacher by origin. I see people interpreting numbers who aren't trained to interpret numbers. I see people handling numbers and looking at numbers and even think they have to produce numbers who don't even know how to properly do that. So, and what I also see is that all these people want to do a great job for children. But in which direction are we looking? And I'll believe, just like Mark, that we're looking far too much towards the numbers instead of towards the children. And if you talk with parents and tell them that you're interested in numbers, you're also going to not only lose the children, but you'll also lose the parents, because who wants to be a number?
Thank you, Rob. I think I'd go to David now and ask David's perspective as a head teacher of a secondary school.
I feel as if I'm an X Factor here. With I don't make as much money as Simon Cowell, right enough. I wish. No, I agree. To answer your question, yes, I agree with the outcome of the report. And as a secondary head, I was really heartened when CFE came out, because I really believe in the principles of it. I think it gives secondary schools and primary schools opportunity to design a curriculum related to their own context. However, like Mark just said there as well, I think we're driven by attainment, and I think we sometimes focus too much on that, and we're not allowing ourselves to look at particularly the broad general education and look at trying to develop skills more around that area. You know, the secondary primary transition, again, we do really well pastoral based, but that curricular transition and that pathway, I would suggest, needs to be looked at the moment, and I'll come in with some other points later on.
Thank you very much. I would also like to ask Bruce's opinion as well, from another secondary head teacher.
So I agree with what's been said to this point. Education is certainly not about the data. It's absolutely about the learning. Young people love learning. I think the issue that we probably have in Scottish education today is a lack of clarity about what our young people should be learning. And I think the OECD really capture that when they're highlighting a tension between knowledge and skills in the Scottish curriculum. I think building on David's point, if we're going to have effective transition, then secondary schools and primary schools need to be crystal clear about what is being taught in the broad general education. I agree that to some extent schools and clusters should be developing their own curriculum, but I do think there needs to be an element of more national prescription, because if moving forward we just try to create what we already have, then we'll just get what we already have, which is that lack of clarity about what students are being taught and supposed to learn.
Thank you, Bruce. I think I'd like to put the question to Marion from an early years perspective and get your take on it.
Yes, unmute yourself. You think by now, after 2 years, we would all remember. I'm going to come back to thinking about the data, because for me, working in the early years, I deal with wanes and not widgets, and so therefore we don't go counting the data in the same way that perhaps my colleagues on either side of me within a secondary school context. The other thing I would pick up on is the OECD 2030 report. A bit like Robert, I haven't read it in its entirety, but one thing that did strike me was, where are the voices of the very youngest children in that report? I'll stop there for now.
We will definitely come back to that point. It's very interesting. I think also to give Jenny an opportunity to also look at from that early year primary and that transition phase as well, in terms of your thinking of the report.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree with the voices around the room. And I think for me, you know, being in a primary school and from my time at Education Scotland, the aspirations for CFE were captured by the OECD, but possibly they hadn't been fulfilled. But that want for that irresistible curriculum, the one that engages, is inclusive, excites everyone about their learning, that is the quest, and you can see it happening right across Scotland. But what I don't think we have is a consistency. And I think a lot of it comes back to a focus on the 4 capacities, because nobody would argue that those is what we want for our young people. And I feel there's a real need to focus on those, particularly right now in the turbulent world we're living in. How can we focus on those right through 3 to 18 and beyond?
Thank you, Jenny. Jihan, I'd like to get your perspective on the OECD report, please.
Yeah, similarly would echo a lot of the comments that have been made already, but also another aspect the OECD report captured in terms of what the curriculum could offer in terms of empowering teachers to have more control and it being less prescribed and teachers being able to deploy a little bit of creativity. But I think one of the constraints was also captured, and I think particularly impacts primary teachers, is actually having the time to create and to develop a curriculum that has breadth and depth. So, you know, it's one thing to have this very aspirational and ambitious curriculum that is child-centered and is, you know, but actually having the practical time for teachers to sit down and work out what's best for their learning community and to develop a really consistent curricular experience for their learners is a real challenge.
Thank you, Jihan. Quite interesting that it's great to be on a panel where most people actually agree with the OECD report, which is quite interesting. Some really interesting comments have been made, and I just want to move on to another point from the outcome of the report. Obviously, CFE has been basically identified as having a strong vision. But how would we reassess the vision with Curriculum for Excellence related to the role of knowledge going forward? Marion, what's your thoughts on that?
I think the vision for CFE hasn't been lost, and I again, to pick up on what Jenny was saying about the 4 capacities, that I think is something we really need to hold on to. I was listening to Gail this morning, and she was talking about not throwing everything away, that we really need to hold on to the things that really work. And if we're thinking about the 4 capacities and about thinking about a curriculum which, from my perspective, needs to be holistic, then those parts for me are the bits we need to hold on to. Maybe some of the other elements that other panel members will pick up on were the things that we need to think about changing. So, you know, around the data, do we really want to be thinking about having an awful lot of data for the youngest children, where perhaps it might be more relevant for those further up in pulling together a picture about where a particular child or young person is at.
Thank you, Marion. Mark, in terms of the role of knowledge within Curriculum for Excellence?
Yeah, this is an ongoing discussion and has been for many years in the world of curriculum studies, particularly through the work of people like Michael Young, Powerful Knowledge, etc. Young's a controversial figure, and a lot of people in the world of education disagree heartily with him, and I have severe reservations about some of the stuff he writes about. But having said that, I think the place of knowledge in the curriculum is absolutely central. I think that one of the key functions of schooling is to acquire the knowledge that we need in order to navigate the very complex societies in which we live. And we've only got to look at, what's currently happening in the world and in the UK is as good an advertisement, I think, as we can have for citizenship education. So we need knowledge about the world. It needs to be developed in a coherent and progressive way that builds concepts. That's a job for direct teaching as well as pedagogical approaches, which include things like student inquiry, dialogue, etc. But going back to the question, the 4 capacities, I think, are fit for purpose. They represent purposes of education. They need updating. They're 15, 16 years old now, longer. My mathematics isn't very good here, by the way. And most curricula are subject to an 8 or a 10-year review cycle. So I wouldn't argue with the concept of having a purposes-led curriculum framed around something like the 4 capacities. I think that they then should drive stuff like selection of content from the huge corpus of knowledge, so that selection of content is fit for purpose. And that doesn't always happen. My colleague Joe Smith, writing about history, for example, has documented how history content is often chosen for very instrumental reasons. It's on the test next year, or we have the textbooks, or it's a sexy topic that's going to engage a class to get them to choose by subject. What we don't always do, and this is a holistic thing across the curriculum, not just by subject, is think about what knowledge young people need to acquire and how we go about organising that. So I think we need to do much more of that. And just one final comment. It relates to the technical form of the curriculum architecture, if you like. We currently have an outcomes-based technical form, and I think that that actually acts counter to the spirit of CFE because it encourages the instrumental selection of content. So one of the things I would like to see, once we've had the national conversation, is a serious look at how we develop something as an alternative which captures more neatly the idea of developing concepts over time and developing knowledge. And stuff like the British Columbia approach to big ideas is a really interesting approach which I think we should explore. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm interested to get Jihan's perception or view on the transition of knowledge as we move through different education spheres.
Yeah, so in my role now, I can kind of look at this from a bird's eye view, working across 4 primary schools that send pupils up to the high school. And in terms of the experience of those pupils, of the curriculum, it will be very different across the schools. So there's a question there about consistency of experience, but in particular in having consistency over what knowledge is deemed to be required for those pupils to also then be successful when they come up to high school and further along. So there's a question there about consistency of experience and being clear about what we feel is the knowledge that pupils need in order to be successful. And I think that from my perspective, the lack of consistency in curricular experience is something that we really need to try and tackle. And there's another component too. CFE talked about IDL, as the interdisciplinary learning experience, but I feel that was one area that was really poorly defined in CFE and has actually led to a lot of misunderstanding as to what IDL is, and it becomes part of this debate over whether we privilege knowledge or skills, and IDL is often regarded as an approach that privileges skills without having that disciplinary knowledge there. But good IDL actually is about promoting and developing that knowledge first, and the knowledge required in order to apply that to complex problems. So I think also there's room there to revisit and develop our understanding of what IDL is, because I think that offers a great opportunity for really developing and realising the ambition of the curriculum.
Thank you, Jihan. Bruce, I'd like to get your perspective in terms of knowledge, and I would broaden out to skills and that transition from primary school, secondary school beyond, in terms of what is important in terms of that knowledge transfer and the skills, in terms of what Curriculum for Excellence can offer, and also thinking about the connection into further and higher education.
So I said earlier that I think the problem that we have today is a lack of specificity in terms of what is being taught, knowledge, skills, specific experiences. If primary doesn't have a clear understanding about what is going to be taught in the early stages of secondary and secondary in the late stages of primary, then we risk a fragmented curriculum where there is unnecessary repetition. So we're not getting the levels of challenge that we know are so important, or we risk gaps. There are things that we just take for granted should be taught and learned, but which aren't, because it hasn't been mapped out in the level of detail that I think it needs to be mapped out in. That's the same issue that we have with IDL at the moment, interdisciplinary learning. That can have a really powerful role to play in the curriculum, but only if we make meaningful links, and we can only make those meaningful links rather than tokenistic ones if we have some clarity about what is being taught and where. I would challenge any notion that secondary head teachers are primarily concerned with counting data. Speaking for myself, probably speaking for David and other secondary heads, data actually comes low down my list of concerns day to day. What I'm fundamentally interested in is the quality of the curriculum, a broad and deep curriculum which focuses on knowledge, skills and specific experiences. I agree completely with what Mark says. I think we go wrong when we focus too much on attainment and therefore end of school exams. I think we go wrong when we focus too much on the developing the young workforce agenda. It's not to say that attainment and developing the young workforce are not important, but cultural capital is so important. We're trying to teach our young people a broad and deep body of knowledge so that they can really understand and contribute to the world around them. I think it's Dylan William who talks about the big mistake that we've made in education is not to focus enough on giving our young people the tools that they need to think with, and the tools that they need to think with to understand and contribute to the world around them. Well, that's knowledge. And I think where we need to go in Scotland is to start to map that out far clearer.
Thank you, Bruce. Rob, your views on knowledge and skills and transition through education, please.
Yeah, first of all, I'm thinking about all the schools that I've visited in the last couple of years. So I've visited, of course, schools in the Netherlands, but also in Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, the Middle East, South Africa, etc., etc. And I'm fortunate enough that a lot of these schools invite me because they want to change. And all these schools have the same problem, in my opinion, because they feel taken hostage by all the other schools. They want to develop themselves as education, but they feel hostage because the school that they're going to send the kids afterwards aren't changing at the moment. So I think we as education have the responsibility to grow as education. And what I see is that the debate about knowledge and are we delivering enough knowledge in our school to prepare them for the next school is really taking us hostage. And what I also see is that some principals and educators even use it to not grow themselves, to not educate themselves anymore. So I think it's a very difficult debate. What I also believe is that in the last 100 years, we added more and more what I call core knowledge. So that we expect far more basic knowledge from children than 100 years ago. I believe that's impossible. Their head didn't grow twice as big as 100 years ago. So we have to have a good look at what is the core knowledge that these kids need for their future, instead of taking the core knowledge that I need for my future and add knowledge to that as well. Because then, how can we make them really grow? So it's a very, we also have to have the guts to, when we have that list of knowledge, to wipe things off the list when we add things. And I don't see that really happening at the moment when I go into the schools. I see a lot of adding on to the curriculum instead of taking things away, because that's what I needed for my future. You need something else.
Thank you, Rob. Very jealous of all the countries that you visited, by the way.
My wife as well.
Picking up something that Bruce said, I want to move on to the next question, which makes it look like I've actually planned this, and I've thought about it, which I have. But I'm quite thankful that he mentioned this, and I'd like to put this question to David. How can we find a better balance between breadth and depth of learning and knowledge and skills within Curriculum for Excellence?
I think I'm going to go in Rob's suitcase when he leaves here as well, so I can get. But it's a really good question, and just going back to your previous question, I believe that CFE does have a strong vision, and it hasn't been lost, as Marion says. It hasn't been lost. We just need to go back and refresh it and review it. And as Mark says, the 4 capacities are fit for purpose, but we need to remind ourselves, how do they fit into our curriculum is really important. But skills and knowledge go together as far as I'm concerned, and that really does design your breadth and depth within your curriculum. For me, young people learn when they're doing, not when they're sitting in front of a textbook, and that really is so key to designing a curriculum that is going to be broad and deep. Because if you want your young people and your children to be going out and into the world with the skills that they need to go out to employment, apprenticeships, further education, higher education, they need to learn it by doing practical activities. We've just come out of this pandemic and we've seen it ourselves, where we have young people sitting in classrooms with textbooks and it's not working. So we need to develop opportunities to ensure that the breadth and depth of experience for our young people and children is appropriate. I look at primary schools. I'm very jealous of primary teachers, because the active learning that takes place in there, and you just see the breadth and depth in there when you go into primary schools, and the real active learning, and young people are learning as they're doing. Then in secondary schools, they maybe have 2 teachers in primary. They come to secondary schools and they've got 14 or 15 teachers. You know, is that the right way to ensure our young people are learning? You know, there's a big debate in there as well, and is that depth appropriate? Do you know, as well, that's a real hot topic question as far as I'm concerned. I think with breadth and depth, sometimes as teachers we have to take risks. We just have to go and do things to try and develop a curriculum that's going to be broad and deep for our young people. But certainly, in my opinion and in my experience, young people learn better when they're actually taking part in real life learning experiences, and that's broad and that's deep as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks for that, David. I just wanted to ask, and I'll come to Jenny in a second, do you think that Curriculum for Excellence gives permission to take risk? Is there enough flex within it, do you think, for it to actually allow that to happen? David?
That's why you have to take the risks. Do you know, I think, you know, we were talking about guidance and guidelines and benchmarks, etc. You can determine what they look like. And if you're willing to take a risk and take a gamble, you can design a curriculum that suits your school. There's no doubt about it. So I think, yes, but you've got to be willing to do it. You've got to be willing to take that step.
Great, thank you. Jenny, you know, just building on from that, in terms of, you know, your perspective of breadth and depth of learning within the environment that you're currently working in, and also, you know, what's your feelings around about that, but also think, are we too silo-based? Is there enough connection between the, you know, primary, secondary, tertiary, FEH? Is there enough, you know, experience sharing to understand what we're working in and what we should be doing for young people, making it, you know, young people centric?
Yeah, if I can go back to the breadth and depth, you know, looking at curriculum design, and very, very clear that the 4 contexts are key to that, because within that, if you look at the opportunities for personal achievement, the opportunities for IDL, the curricular areas and the ethos and life of the school, and you see that as a totality of the curriculum, they all link and interfeed within each other, then that in itself gives great opportunity for breadth and depth. Also, I feel really important to look at the spaces, interactions, experiences from realising the ambition. I constantly refer to that. Our whole school improvement plan is looked upon through those lenses. And then suddenly you start looking at, so where are the spaces where the young people learn the most? Where are they most engaged? And who are the interactions they're having with, and what are the experiences? And then suddenly you're not in a classroom area, you're looking at all the spaces within the community, within the school. And I feel that sort of approach could help hugely to get the consistency across from 3 to 18. I don't think it is there just now. I think there's a lot of work to be done with the broad general education, S6 to S3, and from going to secondary into further education. But I just find that 4 contexts a really useful lens to look through. Did that answer your question?
No, very interesting, yes. I wanted to just get Marion's perspective, you know, from the early years, you know, that foundation where we're working with our young people at the earliest stages, which can have the biggest influence on their learning journey. In terms of that, you know, your engagement, in the early years engagement and the breadth and depth of the curriculum.
Thank you. I would pick up on a few points that have been made already. I think your point about dropping off things that are unnecessary. Often if you have a child-led play experience, then there's that co-creation of knowledge, and the areas that you would engage with the child, and the experiences and spaces that they occupy, and that those spaces go beyond the confines of where the setting is. And so that takes you out into the community, and the child then helps to build the knowledge that's relevant for them. And so you're being responsive, and so therefore you have a curriculum which is fit for purpose, as opposed to, and I would pick up on what Bruce was saying, and it doesn't sit particularly well with me, to think about the rigidity of a curriculum that, you know, is being suggested. And I take the point that by the time you get to secondary school, we're more subject-based, but within an early years setting, then it's holistic. We're within an hour, a child could cover all areas of the curriculum quite easily, and that co-creation of knowledge adds the depth and the breadth, but it's also down to the interactions between the adults who support the child, and that's how the uniqueness of the curriculum comes about. It's taking account of the environment, of the spaces and the community that the child actually inhabits.
Thank you, Marion. I want to ask Jihan, in terms of transition, do we get that right in terms of balance and breadth and depth of the learning through the transition?
We don't at the moment, but I think and I would echo a lot of the comments already made, but if we would agree that primary schools do breadth quite well and secondary schools do depth quite well, then the answer there is about collaboration. And what's really sorely lacking at the moment is collaboration across the primary and secondary sectors. I think if we had more opportunity for primary teachers to spend more time in high schools observing and looking at how things are done pedagogically there and vice versa, we'd start to develop a more common mutual understanding of what we do in each other's context, because I think there's a lot of ideas about what we do in different sectors based on perception, but perhaps not grounded in reality, simply because we're not talking with each other. CFE, again, envisions a broad and general education that goes from nursery right the way through to S3. But my experience of what the broad and general education looks like in high schools at the moment is that it starts to fall away. It becomes immediately very specialised from S1 onwards. And that shouldn't really be occurring until S3. So my answer there is really that we don't have that balance, but collaboration is the key there. The more that we're talking and understanding what goes on in each other's context, there's real opportunity to plan learning experiences that have input from both primary and secondary practitioners that help children to really explore real-world problems and develop the knowledge that's required to that and the skills to solve those problems. So the point is collaboration is key.
Thank you very much. I have an online question that I'd like to throw in at the moment to Rob. So we've had a question in, Rob. How does the Agora School manage to ensure coverage of the curriculum when learning is mainly led by the learner's interests? Over a number of years, are there gaps in the knowledge or skills that learners develop?
I think, first of all, we must remember that we are all institutionalized. I've spent my whole life in school. So what I do in schools is copy what I saw there. And what we've seen there and what we know about how people learn and what would be best ways to learn, I think that's miles apart. So what we started doing is try to do the opposite. And when you try to do the opposite, you soon realize that that's not good enough. So I now like to say that there is nothing wrong with the elements of traditional education. The problem is that we do all these elements far too much. But we should do them at the right moment, at the right time, with the right person. And then it's magic. So in my school, that means that if I can't get a kid interested in mathematics right now, I'm not going to force feed him mathematics. But I have the responsibility to get his mathematics level at a certain level before he finishes the school. So I have also the responsibility to connect the things that this kid needs to know about mathematics to their personal interests. And I like to refer to this as a window of opportunity. We all know that kids between certain ages, and you will know the ages, I don't know, but let's say between 4 and 8, there is no kid that doesn't want to learn to read between the age of 4 and 8. The only thing we can do is demotivate them by forcing all the kids to learn how to read at the age of 4. So what if we respect this window of opportunity and start at the moment that we see the spark and that the moment that we can ask the right question, and the question is, do you want to learn how to read? And that would mean that the kid answers yes. Then I can do the most traditional stuff with the kid. I can give him a book. I can give him old school guidance, etc., 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 and they will learn it very fast. So giving the students the chance to be involved in what we do and when we do it, the only reason we do that is because we can observe and study the student and see the windows of opportunity and connect to that, because we have the responsibility to cover certain parts of the curriculum. So it puts us, instead of in the teaching mode and the preaching mode I'm doing now, it's like there's not a lot of difference. Instead of that, it puts us in an observing mode, the kindergarten mode, I like to refer to it. And what we do in kindergarten, and what I see in kindergartens, is that teachers aren't teaching. They are observing, watching for the opportunity, putting stuff in front of kids, like a dog who puts a ball in front of you and hopes that you throw it away. And if you don't throw it away, the dog will grab the ball and do it again. That's our job in education. We only have to put the ball in the right position and the kids throw it away. They want to play with it. And that's why we start with a student-driven environment. And then we have a very hard job because we have to connect to that. We have to put the balls in the right position and be disappointed at the end of the day that the kid didn't throw the ball away. But we shouldn't be disappointed in the kid. We made the wrong observation. Is that an answer?
I think that's a great answer. Thank you for that. It was a good question as well. So I have another question from online. I would like to put this one to Mark and then Bruce to get both their opinions on this. We regularly speak about differentiation of learning, but we have never developed differentiation of assessment, particularly in the senior phase. How do we get this built into the curriculum, particularly within the review of national qualifications in the senior phase?
That's an interesting question. Yes, so differentiation of assessment, I think, sums up very nicely by a cartoon that many of you will have seen that did the rounds a few years ago of the assessment task being to climb the tree. And there's a goldfish and an elephant and a monkey and a parrot all sitting there. So that sums it up quite nicely. I mean, what we effectively have at the moment is a system which is geared to assessing one type of approach, largely written answers in high-stakes assessment. And that benefits some people and it doesn't benefit others. So that's the basic problem we have. How do we ensure we have differentiation? Well, I'd like to see a far more eclectic way of assessing, and this is something we try and do in the universities. So we don't actually use exams anymore in education, but many departments do. I see the place of exams, but let's also think about coursework that's done during the school day that's embedded in the work that people do. Let's think about assessment as opportunities to observe what people are doing. So presentations is a formal way of doing that, but we can also have informal observations. And this is really about broadening the range of assessment opportunities. And what we have to remember, I think, here is that assessment is fundamentally a judgment about where someone is at the moment. It's a judgment made by someone who knows what they're talking about, hopefully. And that judgment is then used subsequently in different ways. It can be used summatively to provide a grade. It can be used formatively in order to promote further learning. We can diagnose learning issues, diagnostic assessment. Unfortunately, we use assessment an awful lot in an evaluative sense to judge the effectiveness of schools and teachers, and that has a significant backwash effect, which we are seeing in Scotland a lot, not just in the senior phase, but actually in the way that the BGE is structured, which I think other speakers have raised today. This backwash effect, I think, is a significant driver of the curriculum. So the differentiation of assessment, I guess, is what I'm saying is essential both for the students in order to have an equitable experience of being assessed, but it has system effects, which I think if we have a more eclectic range, we'll see a system which is less driven by one particular mode of assessment.
Thank you very much, Mark. Bruce.
I think to some extent the end of course assessment that we have in place is already differentiated because we have different levels. The assessment for National 3 and National 4 typically is different for the assessment to the National 5, the higher, the advanced higher. There is a component of coursework in most of the courses at National 5 and higher and advanced higher. I think there are real problems if we move away from a standardised model of assessment towards one which might be more about teacher judgment, with different schools producing different assessment instruments which are of different quality. I think we've seen that in the alternative assessment model that we had last year. I think there are real issues that come from that. The criticism that sometimes is levelled at exams is that the questions are just testing rote learning, shallow knowledge, if you like. And sometimes that's fair, but the solution is not to throw the examination away. It's to come up with better questions, questions that actually do test critical thinking and problem solving. So I'd be sad. I think it would be a backward step if we were to move away from standardised assessment altogether. And the last thing I'll say, just building on what Mark said, the end of course exams are about the only assessments that we have in school that are purely summative in that they're used to determine a grade, but there's little formative information that can be derived from them. We know that any assessment instrument can be used for summative and formative purposes. Some lend themselves better to one than the other. But wouldn't it be a positive step in Scottish education if the final assessment was actually returned to schools so that there was real learning that could come from that? And then the curriculum, if we're going back to that, actually does become coherent, because we can go back in a responsive way and adapt our teaching and what students are learning about according to how they did in the summative paper.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I'd like to move on to a different question now. And we've touched upon some of this, but I'd just like to explore it further. I'd like to ask the panel, how can Scotland's education partners adapt the senior phase to match the vision for Curriculum for Excellence? Do we need to think differently in terms of tertiary education and that transition and progression? I'd like to put that to Jihan. Yeah. So how can Scotland's education partners adapt the senior phase to match the vision for Curriculum for Excellence? I think there's a feeling that the senior phase is out of connection with the visions for Curriculum for Excellence. I think it's what's been said is that the vision's strong, but there's a feeling that there could be a review of the senior phase in terms of Curriculum for Excellence, its visions and its philosophies, and how would the partners adapt that and look at that going forward?
I think it requires quite a strong degree of risk-taking, because when you get to that point and it's high-stakes assessment, so the urge is really, it becomes about that sort of transmission of knowledge, that we've got to ensure that the pupils know certain things in order to be successful and to be able to pass the exams. So it's about a willingness to risk doing things differently, so that there's opportunities there again to explore breadth. And again, it's about combining that depth and breadth together so that experiences are more real world and relevant to learners' life worlds. And again, they're having opportunities to develop knowledge and capacities to problem solve. It was an interesting point about perhaps it's about adjusting the questions. If we're going to stick to a standardized system of assessment, yeah, perhaps the answer is about rethinking the types of questions that are asked in exams, so that pupils do have the opportunity to apply and make links between different disciplines. But yeah, I think it's about that risk and knowing the impact that could have on. We're still so driven by results, and high schools are judged on attainment and results, and so long as they are, it makes it really difficult to be dynamic and to take the risks that are required.
Thank you very much. Jenny, I'd like to get your perspective, as a head teacher of a primary school and experience within that sector. How do you think the senior phase could learn? How could it adapt and take the key components from Curriculum for Excellence and really strive forward to be something different?
Yeah, I agree with a lot what Johan said about the real life problems, about how we can use those, how we can adapt those. But I think as well that, we have our SQA and we have our Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework as well. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in the first instance, because we do have those, to make sure that they're aligned, and they're aligned with going on to tertiary, to further education, so that the actual standards that we have on these mean the same in different universities. And so I think that's a big piece of work that needs to happen there. But it's going to take time, because we do have this framework, don't we, just now, and to change it all is going to take everyone working together. I think collaboration, as was said earlier on, it needs collaboration from primary, secondary, further educations, and hopefully, the reports that are coming out are going to help to point us in the direction for that.
Thank you, Jenny. I'd like to move on to a question about leadership. what role does leadership play in defining a new approach to curriculum for excellence? And I'd like to put that one to David.
Leadership is massive. Leadership is not just about a head teacher. Leadership is about your whole school. It's about your senior leadership team, your middle leaders, your staff, your young people, and your cluster. Leadership is huge in there. My issue with leadership is that the system that we have just now as leaders, we don't spend enough time reflecting on our own practice and reflecting on educational issues. A lot of the time that we have is spent a lot of time dealing with day-to-day issues, running around, and a lot of that thinking and development time happens in your own time at night when you're sitting in the dining table with your family, watching the telly, etc. So I think leadership is massive, and we need to think as leaders how we use our time wisely. I think, that we also have to take into consideration, we're talking about the voices of early years, we have to take into account our voices of our children, young people, as part of this process. They are even though they're the here and now, they're our future as well, and it's so important that we take into account their voice as leaders, and that we're looking at developing something that they want to see in their schools, that they want the curriculum to be like. So leadership is key. The local authority leadership is also key to giving autonomy to schools, giving the freedom to schools to design something that fits your own context. And just going back to the last point there about the curriculum as well, and one of the things I feel coming back from the pandemic, there were so many negatives that came out of the pandemic, but there was also a lot of positives that came out of the pandemic, and a lot of that positiveness has come from leadership. And if you look at curriculum just now, as leaders, some schools have kept longer periods to be able to develop the curriculum and trying to develop it broader. And I think as leaders, we need to start thinking out the box. We don't need to go back and revert back to type. We absolutely need to think differently about how we're going to move forward.
Thank you, David. Marion, the role of leadership.
Leadership, and before I touch on leadership, I'd like to go back to some of the points that I'm kind of hearing. And for me as an early years person, my concern is that in the reform of the curriculum that we end up with, again, a curriculum that sounds to me like it needs to be delivered as opposed to being experienced. And for me, there's a real tension there, because coming from the early years sector, children experience the curriculum and they're leaders of the curriculum. So they are the ones that we should be listening to. It's their voices. I draw on some of Alison Clark's work here, who talks about slow knowledge and the unhurried child. And what I'm picking up here is that we've got this end product that we must always be having our heads looking in that direction, as opposed to what Realising the Ambition talks about, is about the child now and where they are at now and what they need, what knowledge do they need. But the knowledge that they might need now may not be the knowledge that will be any good to them by the time they actually leave school, because the world keeps shifting and the demands that is expected of them will keep moving. So it's that skills, it's about values, attributes and capacities that I think we should focus on within a curriculum. And I've tried to avoid at all costs this top-down curriculum, which I just feel the weight of may come out of a reform of the curriculum.
Okay, thank you very much. Bruce, I just wanted to ask your opinion on leadership.
With respect to the point that's just been made, I couldn't disagree more. I think that we do need to map out the curriculum very, very clearly. I think there has to be an element of delivery. That's why we have teachers in schools. That's what the profession is about. Teaching things to young people that otherwise they would probably never have learned about, either because they didn't have access to it or because they just didn't have that time with the expert who could help them in that way. So I think it's a real mistake to suggest that the curriculum is purely about experience. Of course there is an element of that, but delivery, I think, is absolutely key as well. In terms of leadership, I think it needs to be bold, but I think it needs to be clear. And I hope if there's any theme running through my answers, it's about the need for specificity. I think where we've gone wrong in Scotland, it's the very definition of the curriculum, the totality of experiences. I think that sets us off in the wrong direction from the beginning. For me, curriculum is about content, it is about knowledge, it is about skills, and it is about experiences. It is about all three in equal measure. I agree with a point that was made earlier that teachers simply do not have the time to be developing the curriculum that needs to be developed in schools. And that's why we need leadership. There need to be decisions made. Sometimes when it comes to knowledge, people will say, well, whose knowledge is it? And that's fair. And it should always be debated, and it should always be fluid. But that's not a reason not to have clearly mapped out knowledge in the curriculum. And I think really that's where the the leadership comes in. We need some modelling. If schools are going to be empowered to develop their own curriculum, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be, I'm saying there should be an element of national prescription and there should be a strong element of school design. There should be both. But if you're going to have the school design, well, one, teachers need time to do that, and two, there needs to be modelling. There need to be strong examples and there need to be non-examples. We're trying to teach students how to develop, teachers and school leaders how to develop curricula. And the way that we teach them that, well, the principles are the same as the best way to teach students.
I knew that leadership would be contentious. But we strayed slightly from the topic, which is absolutely fine because that's what the debate's all about, and it's really interesting to get different perspectives across the panel. So thank you very much for that input. I've had a question online I just want to throw out there, which is a bit different from what we've been talking about, and I just want to get people's take on it. Can we enhance the apprenticeship route and start earlier? And I'll put that one to Rob.
So just to help me with my English, apprenticeship, that would mean internships and stuff like that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, I think I'll take the opportunity to connect some of the things I've just heard. First of all, why are we educating children? I think children deserve a great place in society. That's why we're educating. So that would mean that we educate them to have a purpose in life and to be purposeful later in life, and also today, because that's also quite important, to be happy and feel purposeful today. So how do we get there? And what does that society where they end up in asks of us, of them? Well, most of the time, even or you're being a great parent, or you're a volunteer, or you have a paid position somewhere. What they ask is you to organize stuff, to communicate with other people, and to deliver products. Maybe you have another job in mind at the moment which delivers a fourth thing, but in general, for me, that's it. So we have to ask ourselves, which of the three things I've just mentioned involves answering questions? So that would only be the communicating part. So how do we prepare kids for society? By letting them develop products, by letting them communicate, by letting them organize stuff. And where do they do that? Get them out there. Because if they aren't out there, they only get feedback from 3 other classmates or from the teacher. And that isn't adding a lot of value to it. And for me, value is very important because that's happiness today. So yes, we have to get these kids out there. We have to connect them with the local environment. How many, I don't know, I guess it's the same in Scotland and the Netherlands. Everybody is living in Amsterdam or is going to live in Amsterdam. We need kids in the south of the Netherlands as well. They don't even know which companies are around the corner. They go study in Amsterdam for occupations that they could do in my hometown. So we need to connect these two in an early phase. So these kids can have a bit of a taste and decide, this is something I like, or it isn't, and that's also great. But if we make that connection early, we solve a lot of problems. So I believe the job of education also is to open up the world for the kids. And that starts in the closest environment. And that's not a closed environment, because schools tend to be a closed environment. The closest environment is your hometown, your home city, everything that you can do by bicycle. For me, that's like you should know everything in there. So that is a very important role. And I also think that is what the curriculum debate should be about. How do we open up the world for kids? Not what do they need to know about the world? Because that is different for every kid, for everybody's future, and for every little village.
Thank you very much. I'm just interested from a different perspective on apprenticeships and internships. We're now moving to a question and answer session, which is open to all people in the room. So I think we've got some roving mics. So could you please make yourself known if you have a question? Put your hand up, please. Don't be shy. Who's going first?
Okay, you have 30 seconds to come up with a
Yeah, absolutely. We've got one at the front here as well. Just got one here and one at the back. Who wants to go first? Do you want to go first? You have one at the back? Yeah, let's go with the one at the back first, thank you.
Hi, I'm really interested to know what you think or how you think digital is going to play a part in curriculum moving forward, delivery and content. I'd be really interested to hear what everybody thinks from early years right the way through to senior phase.
Who would you like that question to go to first? Early years, Marion?
There certainly is a place for digital technologies, digital literacies, and children's experience with engaging with technologies. And so, yes, of course, it will be there, but it wouldn't dominate a child's experience. So they play with technologies, they play with their, at home, they play with pressing buttons and so on. So they learn from that, and it becomes part of their curriculum. So I don't think we can take it away. It will be there, but it's what we do to build on it and how we make it accessible.
Thank you, Marion. I'll put them to Jenny.
Yep, agree, and absolutely a tool, a driver. We used technology so well during COVID, and that has carried on. And that way of giving children personalisation and choice, inclusivity. Google Translate, we've just had a lot of Ukrainian refugees come to our school, and that's absolutely fantastic. It's allowing them access the curriculum. I don't think it's going to go away. It's just going to be a key driver, but a tool for the children.
Thank you. Do we have another question from the floor?
Thank you. I'm interested in what the panel's views are on the professional learning that might be needed to support curriculum making.
Mark?
Well, as you well know, we've been doing a lot of work in this area. Lawrence Stenhouse, famous curriculum theorist, said 50 years ago that there is no curriculum development without teacher development, and that's absolutely true. Curriculum development or curriculum making and professional learning should go hand in hand. And actually, it's not just a relationship where one precedes the other. You can actually do curriculum making through professional learning. So the approach that Valerie Drew and myself use at the University of Stirling, critical collaborative professional inquiry, we've been using very successfully now for around 10 years to develop curriculum in schools in Scotland and in Wales, and also some work in the Republic of Ireland as well. And this involves people basically engaging in systematic learning through peer dialogue, reading, professional reading, engagement with critical friends who ask awkward questions, i.e. me and Valerie, and then developing the curriculum through that. So I think it's absolutely essential, but it's not something that happens in a vacuum. It requires time. It's not something that should happen at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. It requires structure, which is important. I think that one thing that's been really missing in Scotland, and to some extent it has happened in Wales, is the existence of what we call the meso layer of curriculum making. So that is the middle layer that sits between schools and policy. which connects teachers with policy. And there's a whole range of functions in there. It can be guidance, of course, we've had plenty of that in Scotland, but it could also be the sort of curriculum leadership where expert teachers work with colleagues to develop resources and develop the curriculum. And I absolutely buy the points that have been made that, you know, many teachers don't have time to make the curriculum. In fact, there's been some research done in the Netherlands in the University of Twente, which suggests that actually it takes around 100 hours to do an hour of curriculum. That's a lot of time that teachers don't have. So one of the things that this meso layer can do is actually produce resources which can be used by teachers across the system. And that is something I think that we need to investigate very much more closely in Scotland. So the research we've done across Europe in the book we published last year, Curriculum Making in Europe, suggests that the meso curriculum making activities are probably the most significant activities for supporting micro, i.e. producing and developing programs of work in school, and nano, what happens in classrooms, the transactional curriculum. Without the meso, the nano and the micro are impoverished. Okay, so I think it's absolutely important that we have the structure to facilitate both the professional learning and the curriculum making as they go hand in hand.
Thank you, Mark. David.
Yep, I think professional learning is key to developing an effective curriculum, but we don't have the time. That's the big issue. We get 5 staff development days a year, you know, and that's not enough. So we need to make the time. I would suggest that we need to cut down our school improvement plan priorities and really focus in on the curriculum and make that our #1 priority and arrange all our professional learning around that to ensure that we are going to design a curriculum that suits the needs of each individual school.
Thank you. I'm not measuring agreement, but there was a lot of nodding heads there. So obviously a point well made. We have another question from the floor.
Thank you. We're gathered here tonight as parents, practitioners and leaders. And I suppose interesting to know young people here tonight, which is interesting to note. I suppose one thing, how would we demonstrate courage and bravery within our respective roles in taking forward curriculum at this point in time?
Jihan.
That's a great question. Something I'm concerned with definitely in my new role as a transition teacher, because working in a position like this where I'm charged with kind of developing the curriculum, you're asking people to change the way that they do things, and that is often a sort of a question that will be met with a little bit of resistance, because as teachers we all get used to doing things a certain way and we kind of get set in that way, and if someone just dropping in and starting to ask you to ask questions or to think about things a little differently is a difficult position to be in, but you know, curriculum making necessitates innovation. If we don't innovate, it just becomes static. It has got to be constantly evolving. So we have to be willing to kind of take those steps to try new things and to be open to change. And it kind of also comes back to that question earlier about leadership. I didn't get to have my input there, but leadership becomes really essential here too, because if you have leaders that are open to that risk-taking and allowing you to try it and do things differently, that's where I think we start to make progress. But if you have leaders that are kind of set in their way, or you know, are worried about the consequences of the unknown, that can really stifle innovation in a school system. So I sort of tacked on an answer to that question there as well, but it's absolutely essential that we are brave and courageous in trying new things.
Thank you very much indeed. Bruce?
So I think it's a good question. I think the school that I lead, Berwickshire High School, I think it has been brave and bold in its development of the curriculum. A significant piece of work carried out over 18 months to unpack the experiences and outcomes into the sort of specific content that I'm talking about, getting student voice into that. So it's not a case of excluding students and teachers solely are involved in the design, getting parental voice in as well, and understanding that this is fluid, that this should change over time. We've worked really closely with our partner primary schools to try to develop that sort of common core curriculum in particular areas. Everybody's talked about the barrier being time, so we've just got started in that, but we have now a common curriculum in particular areas. We're not trying to limit learning. This is a core that teachers can go beyond, which students can go beyond to personalise, etc. But I think compared to a lot of what has been going on nationally, I think this is quite bold. Last thing I'd just like to call out in curriculum design, because Mark was suggesting earlier that one of the problems that we have in the experiences and outcomes is that focus on outcomes, and I agree with that, and I keep talking about content. I think we need to be brave as well to say that many of the experiences and outcomes wrap pedagogy up with curriculum. And when we come to the topic of leadership and being bold in terms of our leadership, I think we need to call out that curriculum and pedagogy are related, but they're different. And I think we all need to be clear about that if we're going to take forward curriculum design.
Thank you very much indeed. Jenny, do you want to offer an opinion?
Yep, I think absolutely agree. You need to be brave, you need to be courageous, but you need to do it in collaboration. So we've done a lot of co-create, where we've involved the parents, the children, the partners, the communities, so that there's that shared vision going together. So it's not one person dreaming something up in their room and then thinking that's the way forward. So I think to be courageous and brave, you need to be collaborative, you need to be open, you need to take people with you. And it's really important to have all those voices in there.
Thank you very much indeed. Do we have any other questions? Does anyone of the panel want to offer an opinion? Rob?
I also see another question, so that we can do that as well. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, likes to use the expression "sweat on the wrong back." And when I hear that developing an hour of curriculum costs 100 hours, I think that would be a case of sweat on the wrong back. So the way we are looking at curriculum is that we have to develop something. And what I would like to, and what I'm challenging my staff to, is to get more into the zone that you ask the right question, so the sweat is on the other person's back, and that's the student. So I think we have to make a drastic change in how we, well, I don't like the word teach and teacher, but how we train our staff members to make sure that by using all their knowledge to train them to use all the knowledge to ask the right question. Because then these students are doing the research, are doing the investigation, are building the products. And the sweat is on that back. And then we can observe and use all our knowledge to support that. So maybe we can transfer those 100 hours to collaborating with these kids and making great products.
Thank you very much. Mark?
Yes, I just want to finish with a reflection on what we mean by curriculum, because I think we've seen different definitions of it tonight. Curriculum is the totality of experience, for example, which I think is a rather vague and unhelpful definition, but also the view which Bruce is putting forward of curriculum as content. Now, curriculum is clearly content, but I think it's much more than that. So what we've been doing in our work is developing a view of curriculum as social practice, content selection, pedagogy, assessment, evaluation, the support for curriculum making, the production of frameworks. All of these are curriculum making activities that take place across the system. And I think that if you over-focus on one area, then you neglect other areas, and we end up with a system that's unbalanced and potentially a curriculum that lacks coherence and is not progressive in terms of progression through the years. So, and I'm a big fan of structure, but I'm not a big fan of very specific specification of content. I think we need some, and I agree with Bruce on that, but I think that really what we need is a framework, a curriculum framework at a high level which facilitates thinking about these practices and ensures that schools are in a position with the right resources to put those practices into place in a coherent way.
Thank you very much, Mark. Do we have another question from the floor? Thank you.
Evening panel, very interesting discussion. Learning for sustainability was identified by young people as being the most important thing for them. and as such it was put in the Muir report as an entitlement. So I'm wondering, do the panel see the learning for sustainability in its broadest sense as a potential wraparound around which the curriculum can be framed? And if so, if you had a wraparound around the curriculum, does that encourage greater interdisciplinary learning?
Who would like to take that? Mark?
Funnily enough, I'm doing a whole workshop for the West Lothian and Forth Valley RIC on this on Tuesday. But I don't see it as a wraparound. I see it as one of the core themes, one of the core issues and problems that need to be addressed. And yes, absolutely, we need to have an interdisciplinary approach. And I would take issue with what the OECD say about interdisciplinary knowledge, for example. I don't think it exists. But what we have are problems that can be best dealt with by looking at them from multiple perspectives, from different disciplinary knowledge perspectives. And the key thing about IDL is how we address something like sustainability by looking at different perspectives, taking this perspective, and then synthesizing and integrating. So for me, it's an issue of how we integrate the curriculum, and I think sustainability is one such role. There are other roles as well, of course, around societal cohesion, for example, inequality, etc. We can go on.
Thank you, Mark. David?
I agree with Mark. I think Mark's point is very valid. It shouldn't be a wraparound. I do think it does lend itself to real interdisciplinary learning when you look across different curricular areas, where you could come together and create a real meaningful interdisciplinary project with an end point. So I think it is absolutely key to what we try and do with our curriculum, but I don't think it should be a wraparound.
Thank you very much. Marion?
From an early years perspective, I see sustainability as something that permeates everything that happens within an early years establishment. Children are very quick to pick up on issues that are important to them, important to their communities, and it's certainly not a discrete thing, and it wouldn't be considered as something you would wrap round an early years curriculum, but it would certainly feature as something within an early years curriculum.
Thank you very much. Bruce?
So I agree with everything that's been said before. I think a weaving through rather than a wraparound. Potentially it is a theme on which to hang different content in an interdisciplinary sense. A point that's been made by panel members is that the curriculum should be fluid. It should be subject to change. So when a particular theme like sustainability is flagged up as being something that's important, then the curriculum that we have nationally should be flexible enough so that that theme can be woven in.
Okay, thank you very much. We are down to our last couple of minutes, so I'll ask Jenny if you could be quite quick on this, because we are coming towards the end of the live stream, but if you could just give a very brief feedback, please, that would be appreciated.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with everything said. Absolutely. Should be a key driver. It is a theme. It is the most perfect way for IDL to be used successfully. But the children, I feel, have to experience it. They need to be out there, need to be investigating. They need to be having those real life skills, those problem solving. And that approach is much needed across our curriculum as well as for sustainability.
Thank you very much indeed. So that's us now finished with the panel, and I would just like to ask a colleague to bring this to a close, please.